The most dangerous tool in any workshop is not the saw or the torch. It is the human mind when it is filled with overconfidence. It's a mindset that turns a simple DIY project into a fatal equation. In this video, we will conduct a forensic analysis of 6 DIY disasters. The actions described were deadly and must never be repeated under any circumstances. The garage was quiet on that October afternoon in 2015. It was the kind of silence unique to a suburban Wisconsin workshop, filled only by the low hum of an overhead fluorescent light and the faint, clean scent of cut pine. This was the sanctuary of Daniel Miller, a 42-year-old man who could fix anything. He had a natural talent for mechanics and carpentry, a confidence built over decades of successful projects. But his latest obsession was different. It wasn't about building something useful. It was about creating something beautiful. He had discovered fractal wood burning online, an art form that uses high-voltage electricity to burn lightning-like patterns called Lichtenberg figures into wood. The results were stunning, and Daniel was determined to master it. He saw it as the ultimate DIY project, a perfect blend of raw power and delicate artistry. To achieve this, he needed a high-voltage transformer, and the internet offered a cheap and easy solution. The core of a common microwave oven, a device found in nearly every home, seemingly harmless. Daniel, following online tutorials, carefully disassembled a discarded microwave, extracting its magneto-transformer. He understood household AC wiring perfectly. He'd wired his own basement. This knowledge created a fatal blind spot. He fundamentally misunderstood that the transformer's output was not 120 volts, but over 2,000 volts of raw, unforgiving power. He mounted the transformer to a wooden board, attached a power switch, and connected 2 jumper cables to serve as his probes. The setup looked crude, but it worked. The system was simple. A baking soda and water solution painted onto a wood slab would allow the current to flow between the 2 probes, carving a dark branching path as it burned. He felt a surge of pride. He was controlling lightning. Daniel was preparing a special piece, a large slab of polished maple, as a gift for his wife. He meticulously applied the conductive solution. He put on his rubber-soled work boots, believing they were sufficient protection. He flipped the power switch. A low, menacing hum filled the air. He touched the 2 probes to the wood. Instantly, a brilliant, crackling arc erupted, sizzling and popping, as it etched a delicate black line into the maple. It was mesmerizing. He watched the fiery tendrils spread, creating a beautiful, chaotic pattern. But the path wasn't going exactly where he wanted. He needed to adjust the right-hand probe just a few millimeters to the left to guide the burn around a knot in the wood. This was the moment his fate was sealed. Instead of shutting off the power, a simple flip of a switch, his confidence told him he could do it live. He grabbed a wooden dowel, thinking the wood would insulate him from the thousands of volts just inches away. He carefully nudged the metal clamp of the jumper cable. It worked. The arc shifted its course, a small victory. This fleeting success convinced him his method was sound. He decided to make one more tiny adjustment. As he leaned in, his hand, steadied just a moment before, slipped. The motion was imperceptible, a mere fraction of an inch. His index finger slid off the wooden dowel and brushed against the cold, uninsulated metal of the jumper cable clamp. In that instant, the laws of physics took over. The 2,000 volts, always seeking the most efficient path to ground, found one through Daniel's body. The current entered his fingertip, surged up his arm, and crossed his chest, a pathway that included his heart. His cardiovascular system experienced a massive electrical trauma. The coordinated rhythm of his heart muscle was instantly disrupted, throwing it into a state of ventricular fibrillation, a useless, chaotic quiver that pumps no blood. His central nervous system overloaded and shut down, from the moment of contact to the cessation of all brain activity. less than a second passed. The official cause of death was electrocution resulting in immediate cardiac arrest. When his wife came to call him for dinner an hour later, the scene in the garage was eerily peaceful. The fluorescent light still hummed. The transformer on the workbench still buzzed with latent power. On the maple slab, a beautiful half-finished lightning pattern was permanently burned into the wood, an artifact of his final creation. His death, and dozens like it, would later lead to a widespread crackdown on fractal burning tutorials, a tragic systemic consequence born from a project that turned an artist into a conductor for his own fatal injury. The evening of August 22, 2015 in Mount Vernon, Maine, felt perfect for a backyard party. A small bonfire crackled, casting a warm glow on the faces of friends gathered in lawn chairs. The air was cool and carried the scent of late summer grass and barbecue smoke. At the heart of this comfortable scene was 34-year-old Colin Edwards, a man known for his easy smile and his love for simple, fun projects. Tonight, he was the master of ceremonies holding his prized creation, a potato cannon. It was the ultimate DIY party trick, an object born from countless online tutorials and hardware store runs. Assembled from several lengths of white PVC pipe, industrial glue, and a simple push-button barbecue igniter, it had the look of a harmless, oversized toy. This universally shared perception of safety was the invisible catalyst for the disaster. The entire project was built on a catastrophic misunderstanding of basic material science. PVC pipe is designed to manage the gentle, constant internal pressure of water flowing through a plumbing system. It was never engineered to contain the violent, instantaneous shockwave of a controlled explosion. The pressure spike from ignited aerosol propellant is a completely different kind of force, one that attacks the material's integrity in a fraction of a second. Worse, the very material Colin trusted had been silently betraying him. Over months of exposure to sunlight, the sun's ultraviolet rays had been breaking down the long polymer chains in the plastic, a process called photodegradation. The pipe looked perfectly solid, but on a molecular level, it had become dangerously brittle. Each successful firing in the past had created microfractures, weakening it further. Colin, unaware of this ticking clock, was proudly holding a functional pipe bomb. He began the loading sequence with the confidence of someone who had done it many times before. He took a potato and expertly rammed it down the long barrel, ensuring a tight, perfect seal. He then unscrewed the rear cap of the wider combustion chamber, took a can of cheap hairspray, and shot a 3-second burst of flammable propellant inside. He quickly screwed the cap back on, trapping the volatile mixture of butane and air. He hefted the cannon, its white plastic gleaming in the firelight, and aimed it toward the dark expanse of the field behind his house. His friends leaned in, their phones raised to capture the show. They were all anticipating the familiar, satisfying thump of the launch, a sound they associated with harmless fun. They were all participating in the collective illusion of safety. Colin smiled, ready to deliver the punchline. He pressed the small red button on the igniter. A tiny internal spark jumped the gap between two screws. The result was not a launch. It was a detonation. The hairspray and air mixture combusted with absolute efficiency, and the pressure inside the chamber skyrocketed in a microsecond. The force had nowhere to go. The potato, acting as a powerful plug, momentarily contained the blast, but the brittle, compromised walls of the PVC pipe could not. The structure failed completely and instantaneously. Instead of a controlled release of pressure down the barrel, the energy erupted outwards. The pipe did not tear or bend, it shattered. The white plastic tube transformed into dozens of sharp, hardened shards, each one propelled with the velocity of shrapnel. The party toy had just performed its true function as an improvised explosive device. One of the larger fragments from the exploded chamber flew directly at Colin. The projectile caused a fatal, penetrating injury. The damage to his vital systems was immediate and irreversible. His death was instantaneous. The sharp, dry crack of the explosion was replaced by an unnatural silence, broken only by the crackling of the bonfire. His friends stood motionless, the footage on their phones now evidence of a tragedy. On the damp grass, just a few feet away, lay the potato, completely untouched, a mundane object at the center of a fatal equation. The bathroom in Kevin Carlson's Des Moines, Iowa home was a small, claustrophobic box. Built in the 1970s, it had no window, relying on a noisy, inefficient ceiling fan for ventilation. In the humid summer of 2011, the room's stained and chipped acrylic bathtub had become the focus of a DIY obsession for the 31-year-old. A professional refinishing quote of nearly $500 felt like an insult to Kevin, a man who took immense pride in his self-reliance and his ability to fix things himself. He saw the ugly tub not as an obstacle, but as a challenge he could conquer in a single Saturday. This deep-seated belief in his own competence was the first link in a fatal chain of events. At the local hardware store, surrounded by bright lights and helpful signage, he found a professional-strength bathtub refinishing kit. The primary component was a can of thick, gel-like paint stripper. On the back, buried in a dense block of legal text, were the product's warnings and its key ingredient, methylene chloride. Kevin, like most people, saw a product available on a public shelf and subconsciously registered it as safe for home use. He did not know that he was holding a can of invisible poison. Methylene chloride vapor is heavier than air, which causes it to sink and form a concentrated, oxygen-displacing pool at floor level. More insidiously, when a person inhales these fumes, their body chemically converts it into carbon monoxide gas, the same deadly poison that comes from a car's exhaust. The project began on a Saturday morning. Kevin prepared the space, putting on rubber gloves and a thin paper dust mask. He thought these were adequate safety measures, but the mask was designed to stop solid particles, not chemical vapors, offering him zero protection. He closed the bathroom door to keep the smell from spreading through the house and switched on the ceiling fan, not realizing it was only churning the poisoned air, not removing it. He knelt on the floor, his head and shoulders lowered into the tub, and began to paint on the thick chemical stripper. The smell was instant and overpowering, a sickly sweet odor that burned his sinuses. Within minutes, he felt a wave of dizziness and lightheadedness. This was his body's first and most important warning signal. It was the critical moment where he could have walked away. But the powerful DIY mindset, the stubborn desire to push through discomfort and finish the job, took over. He was already committed. He continued to work, breathing deeply, his head positioned directly in the accumulating cloud of gas. Inside his body, a silent chemical process was underway. The methylene chloride was entering his bloodstream through his lungs, and his liver was dutifully converting it into carbon monoxide. This poison then latched onto his red blood cells, which are meant to carry oxygen. The carbon monoxide effectively hijacked his circulatory system, suffocating his body from the inside out. His brain, starved of oxygen, was the first organ to fail. The initial dizziness morphed into a state of confusion, similar to intoxication. His coordination faltered. He likely felt an overwhelming sense of tiredness, an irresistible urge to just rest for a moment. He slumped against the cool side of the tub, quietly losing consciousness without a struggle. His breathing grew shallow as his brain's respiratory center shut down. A few minutes later, his heart, starved of the oxygen it needed to beat, went into cardiac arrest. The official cause of death was acute poisoning by methylene chloride inhalation. When his wife found him hours later, the scene was one of profound and silent tragedy. The fan on the ceiling still whirred uselessly. The bathtub was half stripped, gleaming under the bathroom light. And next to Kevin's body, the can of paint stripper stood like a tombstone, an artifact of a project meant to save a few $100s that ended up costing a life. His death, and others like it, would eventually lead the EPA to ban the sale of methylene chloride strippers to the general public, a systemic change forged from preventable tragedies. The old stone house in the French countryside felt eternal, and that was the problem. For its new owner, a 48-year-old man named Jean-Luc, its thick walls weren't a sign of strength, but a prison for outdated design. In the spring of 2015, inspired by home renovation shows, he decided to create a modern, open-plan living space. His project centered on a single, ambitious goal: to remove the wall separating the cramped kitchen from the formal dining room. He was a man who trusted his own hands and his own judgment. The sledgehammer in his garage felt like the right tool for the job. He looked at the wall and saw a simple, plaster-covered partition. He tapped on it, convinced it was hollow and non-essential. This single, unverified assumption was the fatal flaw in his plan. He did not hire a structural engineer. He never searched for the building's original blueprints. His confidence in his own assessment overrode any impulse for caution. An old house is a complex system of forces, a delicate balance of tension and compression. Certain walls, known as load-bearing walls, act as the spine of this system. They carry the immense, invisible weight of the floors above, the heavy roof, and even the snow in winter, channeling these tons of force safely down into the foundation. To remove a load-bearing wall without providing a new path for that weight is a catastrophic act. Jean-Luc saw a simple room divider. The laws of physics saw a critical pillar holding the entire second story aloft. On the morning of the demolition, he felt a surge of excitement. He opened the windows, letting the bright spring air circulate, ready to embrace the dust and noise of progress. He swung the sledgehammer. The first impact was deeply satisfying, a loud crack that signaled the beginning of a new era for his home. Plaster rained down, revealing the wooden studs beneath. He worked with a steady, powerful rhythm, driven by the vision of the beautiful open space he was creating. As he tore deeper into the wall's structure, the house began to issue quiet warnings. A low, resonant groan from the ceiling joist directly above his head. A fine, steady trickle of dust falling from the cracks around a light fixture. He heard the sounds, but he misinterpreted them. To him, they were just the normal complaints of an old building being shaken up. His focus was locked on the task, on the satisfying destruction of the wall. He finally reached the last central stud, the final piece of the wooden skeleton. He took a deep breath, braced himself, and swung the sledgehammer with all his strength. The stud splintered and shattered. For a single, deceptive moment, there was silence. Then came a sound that was not a groan, but a deep, violent crack from directly above. The primary crossbeam that had been supported by the wall, now spanning a 15-foot gap with no support, snapped under the immense load. The entire floor of the master bedroom above, the heavy wooden subfloor, the antique oak bed, the massive wardrobe, detached from the outer walls and fell as a single, multi-ton slab. The open space Jean-Luc had just created was instantly filled with a cascade of catastrophic failure. He had just enough time to look up, to register the dark shape descending upon him. He was subjected to a sudden and overwhelming crushing force from the debris. The official cause of death was determined to be fatal, compressive asphyxia, and catastrophic blunt force trauma. When the thick cloud of dust finally settled, the scene was one of brutal irony. The kitchen and dining room were now a single, enormous space, just as he had envisioned. But it was an unusable cavern, filled with a mountain of splintered wood, shattered plaster, and the wreckage of a life. Sticking out from the top of the pile, almost like a monument, was the wooden handle of his sledgehammer. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling of Mark Thompson's garage in Boise, Idaho, cast long, distorted shadows on a warm June evening in 2011. The air inside was still and carried the sharp, metallic odor of sulfur and chemical solvents. a smell that had become a source of pride for the 36-year-old software developer. This garage was his private laboratory, his secret kingdom. Here he pursued a dangerous and seductive art, amateur pyrotechnics. Mark did not see himself as a reckless thrill-seeker. In his mind, he was a careful scientist, a meticulous student of a powerful craft. His workbench was a shrine to this belief, with glass jars of crystalline powders and fine metals arranged in perfect alphabetized order. He was preparing for an upcoming 4th of July party, driven by an ambition to create a fireworks finale that would eclipse any commercial display his friends had ever seen. His entire body of knowledge was sourced from the unregulated corners of the internet, scanned military manuals and exclusive online forums where enthusiasts exchanged dangerous recipes. This was the foundation of his fatal miscalculation. He believed that correctly measuring chemicals was the same as being safe. He failed to grasp the vast gulf between mixing a formula and understanding the violent physics it unleashes. Professional firework manufacturing is a science of control, using binders and granulated powders to ensure a predictable, slower burn. Mark's method of mixing fine raw powders was closer to the assembly of a high-explosive detonator. He was meticulously building a series of small, unstable bombs, yet he was utterly convinced he could control the outcome. That evening, he was working on his masterpiece, a large aerial shell designed to burst into a brilliant red star field. He had reached the final, most critical stage, preparing the flash powder. This is the powerful charge that shatters the shell's casing at its apex, scattering the burning stars across the sky. He had a stainless steel bowl on his workbench, into which he had already carefully weighed the potassium perchlorate, an oxidizer that provides a potent source of oxygen. Now he needed to add the fuel, a fine dark gray aluminum powder. He followed his own strict safety protocol. He wore safety glasses and latex gloves. But these precautions were a facade, a performance of safety that ignored the invisible danger he was actively creating. The air in the garage was very dry, a perfect condition for the buildup of static electricity. As he moved on the concrete floor, his clothes and shoes generated a small but significant electrical charge on his body. The workbench was metal. The bowl was metal. The scoop he used was metal. He had unintentionally turned his workspace into a perfectly arranged ignition circuit. He scooped a measure of the dark aluminum powder, his focus absolute. He leaned over the bowl, preparing to combine the two final ingredients. As he brought the metal scoop toward the metal bowl, he performed a small habitual action, tapping the scoop gently against the rim of the bowl to knock loose the last few clinging grains. It was a tiny, insignificant sound, a light tink of metal on metal. That sound was the trigger. The contact created a path for the static charge built up on his body to discharge. A tiny, nearly invisible spark containing just enough energy jumped from the scoop to the bowl, landing directly in the hypersensitive mixture. The chemical reaction was not a fire. It was a detonation. In less than 1,000th of a second, the solid powders underwent a violent conversion into a sphere of superheated, rapidly expanding gas. The explosion erupted outwards with supersonic speed. The blast wave turned every object on the workbench into a lethal projectile. The steel bowl, the glass jars, the hand tools, all became shrapnel. The concussive force struck Mark with overwhelming power, causing catastrophic internal barotrauma. Secondary impacts from the fragmented objects resulted in massive fatal injuries. His death was instantaneous. The explosion blew the heavy garage door off its tracks and into the driveway, shattering every window in the back of the house. When emergency services arrived, they entered a scene of complete destruction. The workbench had simply vanished. Amid the acrid smoke and scattered debris, they found a single, perfectly crafted firework shell sitting on a high shelf, miraculously untouched. A silent artifact of a deadly obsession. The single work light in the garage cast a harsh glare on the scene of a losing battle. In the center of the cold concrete floor in rural Oregon, 52-year-old Gary Jenkins was locked in a physical struggle with an inanimate object, and the object was winning. For over an hour, on a cool afternoon in 2012, he had fought the massive 35-inch truck tire, his sweat dripping onto the dusty rubber. The enemy was the tire's bead, its stiff inner edge, which stubbornly refused to stretch over the wide lip of the 40-pound steel rim. Every attempt with the pry bars, every ounce of leverage he could exert, ended in the same frustrating slippage. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a personal affront to his identity as a capable, self-reliant man who didn't need to pay professionals for a simple job. It was this mounting frustration that made him vulnerable to a dangerous idea, a shortcut he had seen celebrated in the echo chamber of online video platforms. The technique was a seductive piece of folk engineering, often called the starter fluid method. The countless videos presented it as a clever trick, a secret handshake for those who worked on their own terms. The theory was a brutal application of chemistry. A spray of a highly flammable liquid inside the tire cavity, followed by a spark, would create a rapid, contained explosion. This blast, in a perfect world, would generate a pressure wave that would instantly force the tire's bead outwards, seeding it onto the rim with a satisfying thump. The videos made it look effortless, even cool. This presentation was a deadly deception. What they never showed was the catastrophic physics of a failure. A tire is a pressure vessel designed to hold the slow, steady push of compressed air. It is not a cannon barrel engineered to contain a detonation. Gary's patience was gone. He made the decision to gamble. He grabbed a can of ether-based starter fluid and sprayed a long, unmeasured burst into the dark gap between the rubber and the steel. He was guessing, imitating a process he did not understand. The invisible ether vapor, heavier than air, pooled inside the tire's core, mixing with oxygen to create a perfect volatile bomb. He was now kneeling at the precipice of an irreversible event. He pulled a simple butane lighter from his pocket, its tiny flame representing a disproportionate and terrible power. He knelt on the cold floor, the heavy assembly lying flat before him like an offering. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the lingering burn in his muscles from the fight. He flicked the lighter's wheel. A small yellow flame hissed to life, dancing in the still garage air. He slowly, deliberately, moved the flame toward the gap. The instant the flame made contact with the invisible cloud of ether, the laws of physics rendered their verdict. The vapor mixture didn't burn, it detonated. The chemical reaction was instantaneous, converting the liquid into a rapidly expanding ball of superheated gas. The pressure spike inside the tire was immediate and astronomical, far exceeding the structural limits of the rubber sidewall. The tire, which was supposed to be the tool, became the weapon. The immense force found the weakest point in the tire's casing and tore it open with a deafening dry crack that was more like a gunshot than a thump. The sudden, uncontrolled release of energy created a powerful blast wave that slammed into Gary's body. The 40-pound steel rim, propelled by the full focused force of the explosion, was launched sideways. It was no longer a wheel, it was a 40-pound projectile, a steel disc fired with lethal velocity. The combination of the concussive blast wave and the direct impact from the heavy moving rim resulted in catastrophic, fatal blunt force trauma. His death was instantaneous. The garage plunged into an echoing silence, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and chemicals. The truck, still resting patiently on its jack stand, was a silent witness to the tragedy. On the concrete floor, the shredded remains of the tire lay in a twisted heap next to the dented steel rim, a permanent artifact of a viral hack that had delivered a final brutal solution. Every product in these stories had a warning label, and every one of them failed. If you had the power to write a single, brutally honest sentence on one of these items, the transformer, the chemical stripper, the PVC pipe, what would that warning say? Write the one sentence that would have actually saved a life in the comments below. We are compiling a manual of unwritten rules. To read the next chapter, subscribe.